The wind pressed against the windows of Ravenshade Hall, moaning like a creature in pain. Somewhere deep inside the house, a bell rang twice. Slow, hollow, final. Nurse Margaret Elwood knew what it meant. The birth had gone badly. She hurried down the corridor, skirts whispering against the marble floor. The scent of blood and smoke drifted from the master bedroom, where candles burned low and the midwife's hands trembled. On the bed lay Lady Cora Ravenshade, her face as white as the linen beneath her. At her side stood Lord Edmund, still in his evening coat, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. The midwife met Margaret's eyes and shook her head. "The child did not live," she whispered. But before Margaret could answer, a faint sound rose from the cradle by the fire, a thin, uncertain cry, like the mew of a kitten. Everyone froze. Lord Edmund's gaze snapped toward the cradle. "That," he said, "was the wind." Margaret stepped forward despite herself. "My lord, forgive me, but enough." His voice was sharp as a blade. "There is no child." Lady Cora stirred, her lips pale. "Edmund, please." He silenced her with a look. "You will rest, Cora. I'll see to what must be done." When he turned away, Margaret crossed quickly to the cradle. Under the embroidered blanket lay a tiny boy, alive, gasping, fighting for air. His skin was the color of milk, his hair dark and damp. Against her better sense, she lifted him. His heartbeat fluttered beneath her palm, stubborn and small. "My lord," she whispered. "He lives." Lord Edmund spun, face hardening. "Then see that he doesn't." The words struck like ice water. Margaret stared at him, speechless. He set the brandy glass down with a sharp click. "You heard me. The child is not mine. He will not bear my name nor disgrace this house." "Do what you must." Lady Cora pushed herself upright, weak and wild-eyed. "Edmund, no." "Lie down," he barked. "You've done enough." Margaret took a step back, clutching the infant to her chest. "Please, my lord." "It's not for us to decide. Do you value your position here, Nurse Elwood?" His tone was quiet now, almost calm. "You've served us for 6 years. I would hate to see you dismissed for hysteria." Her throat closed. She looked to Lady Cora, who mouthed one word through tears. "Go." Outside, thunder rolled over the moors. Margaret hesitated only a moment. Then she turned, slipped through the servants' door, and ran. The nursery corridor was dark, lit only by the flash of lightning through high windows. The baby whimpered against her shoulder, the sound small but insistent. Margaret's shoes slid on the wet flagstones as she reached the side staircase and descended toward the scullery. Behind her, she could already hear Lord Edmund's voice calling for the butler. She burst out into the courtyard. Rain sliced through the air in silver threads. The stables loomed to her right, the old chapel to her left. For a heartbeat, she thought of hiding there. But the chapel was too close. They would look there first. She wrapped the baby tighter and crossed to the gardener's gate. The iron latch was stiff with rust. It yielded only after a desperate shove. Cold air rushed in from the open moor. The child made a small, wet gasp. Margaret pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Hush now," she whispered. "We'll find you safety yet." She walked through the storm until dawn. The rain soaked through her shawl. Her arms ached from holding him. At last, the road curved toward a rise, and beyond it stood a cluster of stone buildings surrounded by a high wall. St. Aurelia's asylum. Its bell tower was black against the morning sky. A plaque by the gate read, "Refuge for Women and the Afflicted." She had nursed patients there years ago, women with no families, children born out of scandal, the forgotten and the mad. It was not a kind place. but it was quiet, and above all, it was hidden. She pulled the heavy bell rope. The clang echoed through the courtyard. Moments later, a narrow door opened, and Sister Agnes Morley appeared, her wimple stark white against the gloom. Her eyes widened. "Margaret Elwood," she murmured. "Heavens, I thought you were long gone." "I need your help," Margaret said. "For a child." Agnes glanced at the bundle. "Yours?" "No. His mother is gone. His father wishes him the same." The nun's face softened with pity and fear in equal measure. "Do you bring him to a house of ghosts, child?" "Do you know what we keep here? Secrets," Margaret said simply. "And that's what I need." Agnes hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in before the rain remembers you." Inside, the air smelled of candle wax and disinfectant. Rows of iron beds lined a narrow ward, most occupied by women who stared blankly at the ceiling or mumbled to invisible friends. A few children slept in cots near the fire. Their breathing was thin and even, the breathing of the forgotten. Agnes led her to a small side room with a single cradle and a crucifix above it. "He can stay here tonight," she said. "Tomorrow, I must enter him in the register." Margaret looked down at the child. His tiny fingers curled around the edge of her sleeve. "Write him as nameless," she said quietly. "Let the world think he never was." Agnes frowned. "And what name shall I give as his mother?" "None." She swallowed. "Only this." She unclasped the silver cross from her neck and laid it beside him. "If I cannot protect him, perhaps God will." The nun crossed herself. "Be careful, Margaret." "Ravenshade has long arms," Margaret nodded. "So do mothers." Outside, the bell tolled again. 3 slow notes, then silence. She left before sunrise, walking back into the storm. As she reached the crest of the hill, she looked once more toward the asylum. A single candle burned in an upper window. For a moment, she imagined the child's breath against her neck again, the weight of him. Then she turned away. By nightfall, a notice would spread through the servants' quarters at Ravenshade Hall. The nurse dismissed. The child dead. The lady recovering. A lie fit neatly enough to live inside a ledger. But in a small stone room behind the convent walls, a boy named by no one slept beneath a silver cross and a curse he would one day inherit. 20 years softened the stone of St. Aurelia's asylum, but not its silence. The walls kept their habit of listening. Doors still sighed like old lungs. Candles still guttered in corridors that never met the sun. And in that long twilight of a house made for forgetting, Margaret Elwood had become part of the furniture. Orderly steps, steady hands, a voice the frightened learned to trust. They called her sister, though she had never taken vows. The habit she wore was practicality, not creed. A grey dress, a dark shawl, keys at the waist. In the ledger, she was Matron Elwood, the one who knew where everything was and why. Some nights, when the wind scraped its nails along the shutters, she would pause in the side room with the single cradle and the little crucifix, now used for wet nurses' naps or for fevers that needed watching. She would rest a hand where a silver cross had once glinted. It was gone now, pawned years ago for a barrel of coal one winter when the asylum chose between warmth and prayer. On the morning it began again, fog lay thick as wool. Bells from the chapel measured time in iron. Margaret stood at the admitting desk, reading the day's notes by a window clouded with her breath. 3 laundresses from the mill with nervous exhaustion, 1 tradesman's wife with hysteria following miscarriage, and a final entry scrawled by a solicitor's clerk in a careful, expensive hand. Female. Age approximately 19 to 20. Name unknown. Refuses to speak. Delivered under guardianship order by request of Ravenshade Hall. Margaret's spine went cold before her mind allowed the meaning. Ravenshade. The word tasted of stormwater and brandy and a man's voice that could turn truth into weather. She closed the ledger and told her hands not to tremble. The carriage came at noon. Black lacquer, discreet crest, wheels muffled. 2 footmen remained outside as if the air itself were contagious. A third man, narrow-faced and tidy, carried papers in a tin case. He did not introduce himself. He did not remove his hat. Sister Agnes led them to the receiving room. Margaret stood at the far wall, a clipboard in hand, trying not to see too much. The girl who stepped from the carriage was not a girl in any forgiving sense. She was young, yes, but in the way of a blade is young, recently sharpened. Her hair fell in rain-dark coils to her shoulders. Her eyes were grey and alert and far away. Around her shoulders, even in June, she wore a wool blanket with a dull sheen to it, its edge stitched in a thin band of gold thread. The lawyer, he looked like a lawyer whether or not he was, set the tin case upon the table and clicked it open. By order of the magistrate at Dunmere, he recited, the ward here present is to be kept at St. Aurelia's asylum for a period not less than 6 months, for rest and for the restoration of reason, with no visitors save those bearing written authorization from Ravenshade Hall or from myself, in trust. Sister Agnes folded her hands. We accept the suffering who come to us. We do not promise to restore what the world itself has broken. I do not ask for promises, the man said. Only for discretion. He slid a folded paper across the table and tapped its seal. And a receipt. While Agnes read, Margaret studied the wool at the girl's shoulder. Time had abraded the threads, but the pattern remained. Little ivy leaves, hand-stitched in a style she had once known too well. Her fingers remembered it before her eyes did. She reached for the edge. May I? The girl did not answer, but she did not pull away. Margaret brushed the fringe aside and saw near the corner seam a birthmark behind the ear, pale as ash, crescent-shaped. The room tilted. For a moment, she was standing in a storm again, with a smaller weight in her arms and lightning telling secrets to windows. Sister Agnes's voice returned from very far away. And you say she refuses to give her name? The lawyer's mouth thinned. She has had an upsetting month. His glance toward the girl held impatience, not pity. The family prefers her to be comfortable and quiet until arrangements are made. What arrangements? Margaret asked before she could stop herself. He looked at her as if a piece of furniture had spoken. Household arrangements. Margaret set down her clipboard. We do not cure discretion with laudanum, sir. If she is here to be silenced, you have come to the wrong building. On the contrary, he said, and his smile had no temperature. I am exactly where I intended to be. He clicked the tin shut. You will find your accounts more comfortable henceforth. Sister Agnes did not flinch. Leave your address. We send our bills in the light. When he had gone, the girl exhaled for the first time. It was not a sob. It was the long, steady breath of someone who had learned not to waste tears where they wouldn't purchase anything. She looked at the crucifix as if weighing it, and then at Margaret as if choosing between 2 species of mercy. What shall we call you? Agnes asked gently. The girl's lips parted. No sound came out. Margaret lowered her voice to the register she used for children fevered to delirium and for mothers after bad nights. You don't have to tell us what hurts, she said. Only where it is. The girl's hand went to the blanket. She touched the seam near the gold, 2 fingers pressing it as though it concealed a pulse. Here, she said at last, and her voice was smoke and gravel. Then, louder, as if proving something to herself. My name is… I don't know. Names were dangerous things to steal back. Margaret nodded. We'll keep you safe until you remember. She led her to Ward C, the quietest wing, a place where the windows looked inward to a walled garden that had forgotten how to bloom. She made up a bed that did not squeak. She set a glass of water on the table, a sprig of mint in it, to trick the nose into thinking of living things. She fetched broth, and when the girl did not reach for the spoon, she waited, then reached first herself, and ate one mouthful, and the girl followed. Do you dream? Margaret asked. Only in the day, the girl said. At night I keep watch. Over what? Doors, came the answer. No explanation, as if there were no need. Margaret wrote sleeplessness in the margin and watchfulness beside it, and then, rebelliously, courage. When the afternoon lull stretched thin, Sister Agnes joined her at the end of the ward. Well, Agnes said, as if the one word could hold an hour's worry. Ravenshade sent her here, Margaret answered, with a golden edge on her blanket and a seal on her silence. Agnes's mouth twitched. You think she is… I think she carries a mark behind her ear in the shape of a crescent, Margaret said, and the words tasted like confession. And I think there is only one child I have known whose skin remembers the moon. Agnes crossed herself without irony. God keep us, she whispered. If Edmund Ravenshade learns she breathes, he will try to suffocate the century. Not if I learn to breathe first, Margaret said. That night, rain returned, a patient handwriting across the roof. The ward slept in patches. Margaret made her rounds with a lantern and a pocket watch. In bed 12, the laundress twitched after nightmares of boiling vats and scalded hands. In bed 4, a widow cried for a child she would not name. In bed 6, the new girl lay on her side, eyes open to the dark, the blanket pulled high enough that the gold edge caught the lantern's half-light. Margaret stopped beside her. When you wake, does the room come with you? She asked softly. The grey eyes slid toward her. Only the ceiling. I can give you a different one, Margaret said. There's a chapel with a domed top. It looks like sky even when it's stone. The girl blinked, slow as a cat. Is there a door that locks? Yes. Then I'll sleep there. We'll try tomorrow. Silence opened like a gate. Margaret stayed a moment too long, longer than the rules liked, but the rules had never held a child up to a window to see if it would cry. When she finally sat at the ward desk, the ledger lay open to the day's entries. Her pen hovered above the column for notes pertaining to Guardian. She wrote nothing. Then, in the narrow space between lines, she slipped a shadow of truth. Check Parish Registry, St. Margaret's, Dunmere, November 1895. Infant, unnamed. It was like laying a flake of gold leaf under chipped varnish. No one would see it unless they already knew to look. The door to the yard creaked. A shape moved in the garden. The silhouette of a man at the far wall, hat brim low, posture soldier straight. He stood a moment, and then was gone. Margaret rose, heart hammering. On the sill, where the fog had smeared itself, a thumbprint gleamed. At dawn, Father Alaric Dunn arrived with a basket of bread and a sermon he did not intend to deliver. He was younger than most priests were allowed to be in stories. Awkward, where they were graceful. Honest, where they were solemn. He found Margaret in the corridor with a mop, scrubbing a stain no one else could see. You keep hours like a penitent, he said. I keep hours like a nurse, she answered. Then, because it had to be said to someone, Ravenshade sent a ward. A girl who does not know her name, he did not ask which Ravenshade. The hall's shadow fell as far as his parish had ever fallen. Is she in danger here? Only from storytellers, Margaret said, and from the past, which insists on living. He looked toward Ward C. I have a suspicion about pasts, he said quietly. They knock like creditors. Then we shall pay in installments, Margaret replied, and almost smiled. Before noon, the narrow-faced lawyer returned without knocking. He did not bring flowers or inquiries or a second thought. He brought a paper with a seal and said, in that brisk voice men used for moving furniture, a small amendment. The patient is to be denied correspondence and visitors, including any clergy, until her 6 months are fulfilled. Sister Agnes's eyebrows rose. Are we to deny God entry as well? If God has letters of patent, he said, I will read them. Margaret held his gaze. And if the patient wishes to speak? Then she may speak to the walls, he said, and left. In the afternoon, the girl slept for an hour, her first. Margaret watched from the end of the ward and told herself she was counting breaths medically, not maternally. When the girl woke, she pressed fingers to the blanket seam again, as if reassuring herself that the world still had an edge. Would you like the garden? Margaret asked. Do the walls keep secrets there? They have no choice, Margaret said. They walked under the wisteria that had forgotten to bloom, along beds where cabbages grew like modest thoughts. At the far corner, where the wall turned toward the chapel, the girl stopped. She lifted the fringe of the blanket and pulled from the seam a small, folded square of parchment, so thin with time it might have been onion skin, and held it to the light. What is that? Margaret asked, though her bones already knew. A promise, the girl said, written by someone who didn't sign her name. She looked at the crucifix atop the chapel roof and at Margaret's hands, which had started to shake. Do you ever feel, she asked, that your life happened before you were born? All the time, Margaret said. Then we are kin, the girl replied, and for the first time she smiled. That evening, the ward shutters rattled with wind that was not a storm yet. Margaret stood at the window and could not tell whether the weather changed or only the century did. In her pocket, wrapped in cloth, she kept the impression of a birthmark shaped like a crescent and the knowledge that secrets mature like wine or rot like meat, depending on the cellars we keep them in. At prayers, Sister Agnes read from the Psalms. Truth shall spring out of the earth, and righteousness shall look down from heaven. Margaret thought of the garden beds, of the walled sky, of a child who had learned to watch doors in the dark. When the bell marked lights out, a soft knock came at the ward desk. The laundress from bed 12 asked for more blanket. The widow in bed 4 asked for the window to be opened an inch. And from bed 6, the nameless girl said, without looking up, Someone is coming tonight. Who? Margaret asked. The sort of man who doesn't bring flowers, the girl said. He wears his hat indoors. Margaret felt the hair at the nape of her neck lift. Then I will be awake to greet him, she said. Do you always greet wolves? Yes, Margaret said, picking up her keys. But I do not always let them in. Night fell like a lid. Every window at St. Aurelia's asylum was dark, except one. The small one above the matron's desk, where Margaret Elwood kept her lantern burning longer than she should. The corridors smelled of iron and damp wool. Somewhere below, a patient hummed a hymn that forgot its tune halfway through. The clock struck 12. Then came the sound. Carriage wheels on gravel, moving slow, deliberate. Margaret set her pen down. The girl in Ward C had warned her. A man who wears his hat indoors. She stepped quietly into the hall. Through the slit in the shutters, she saw the carriage. Black, unmarked, the sort built for secrecy. The driver didn't dismount. He simply waited while the passenger emerged. Lord Edmund Ravenshade had not aged kindly. His hair, once the colour of autumn leaves, had faded to frost, and the years had carved deep lines into his mouth, creases born not of sorrow, but control. His coat was dark, his gloves darker still. When he stepped into the lantern light, it struck the brass of his walking stick, a serpent coiled around a cross. Sister Agnes Morley met him at the door, candle held high. "My lord," she said cautiously, "visiting hours ended at sunset?" "I am not here as a visitor," he replied. "I am here as a benefactor." Agnes's face didn't change. "Our benefactors arrive by post, not by carriage at midnight." He removed his hat, but not his arrogance. "Then let us call this charity's inspection." Margaret, hidden in the shadows near the stairwell, could see his gaze sweep the hallway like a blade. He wasn't looking for the sick. He was looking for a secret. Agnes straightened her back. "If you have business here, state it. My patients are asleep." "Not all of them," he said. "A young woman was brought to you weeks ago. She has delicate lineage. Her family fears she may do herself harm if left unattended." Agnes hesitated. "You speak of Miss—" He cut her off. "You know the one." He stepped closer. "You will bring her to me." Agnes's grip tightened on the candle. "That child is under our care. No patient leaves this house without written order from the magistrate." He smiled thinly. "You think I require ink to command obedience?" "I think you require God," she said, and did not move. For the first time, he seemed to notice Margaret in the shadows. "And you?" he said quietly. "Do you share your superior's defiance?" Margaret bowed her head, every muscle in her body taut. "I share her duty, my lord." He studied her face. "Have we met?" "No, my lord." Her voice barely carried. "I am only the nurse." "Only," he repeated, as though tasting it. Then he turned back to Agnes. "Very well. If the asylum wishes to keep her, you may. But know this. If any word escapes these walls, your order will lose more than a reputation. I have influence in the diocese." "And influence," he added, tapping the serpent-headed cane against the floor, "is a far older religion than yours." He turned, cloak sweeping, and strode back into the night. The carriage rolled away before Agnes exhaled. When the sound was gone, she whispered, "He lies like breathing." Margaret nodded, and he came to be sure she still does. Sleep was impossible after that. Margaret walked the ward, lantern low, checking every bed, every lock, every shadow. At bed 6, the girl lay awake, eyes open. "He came, didn't he?" the girl said. Margaret sat beside her. "Yes." "Did he see me?" "No. And he won't. Not while I draw breath." The girl's fingers clutched the blanket seam. "He said I was unwell." "Are you?" She hesitated. "Sometimes. But not in the way he means. Tell me." The girl's gaze drifted toward the ceiling. "I remember a house by the river. Black stone, long windows. I remember voices behind doors, arguing, whispering my name when they thought I slept. And then one night, I woke in a carriage. A woman was holding me. She sang until I stopped crying. She smelled like smoke and lavender." Margaret's hands went cold. "She wore a cross," the girl added softly. "I used to touch it when I was afraid." The room seemed to shrink. "Do you remember her name?" The girl shook her head. "No, but I remember her voice. It sounded like yours." Margaret turned away, blinking hard. "You've had fever dreams." "The mind makes its own ghosts." The girl reached out, catching Margaret's sleeve. "Then why do your hands shake when you touch my blanket?" Silence. only the wind against the windows, steady as breath. Margaret knelt beside the bed. "Because I once held a child who never should have been born," she said quietly, "and sometimes I think he still breathes in my arms." The girl stared at her, something dawning behind those grey eyes, recognition too fragile to name. "You knew my mother?" Margaret hesitated. "Yes, and she was braver than anyone in that house." "Then she's dead," the girl said, without asking. "Yes," the girl swallowed. "And my father?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "He was here tonight." For a long moment neither spoke. Then the girl whispered, "I think he means to kill me." Margaret closed her eyes. "Then we won't let him." By dawn, word spread that a patient had fallen ill, the kind of illness that required isolation. Margaret arranged it herself. The small chamber off the chapel, the one that once held her cradle room. She told the staff the girl had taken fever. Only Sister Agnes knew otherwise. At midday, Father Alaric Dunn arrived again, summoned quietly. He listened as Margaret told him everything: the blanket, the mark, the midnight visit. He drew a slow breath. "If Ravenshade discovers you hid his child once, he'll not forgive a second time." "I'm not asking forgiveness," she said. "I'm asking time." He studied her. For what? For the truth to find its legs. That night, rain returned, harder, colder. Margaret sat by the girl's bedside in the chapel chamber. The candlelight trembled across the stone floor. "Do you believe in fate?" the girl asked suddenly. "I used to," Margaret said. "Then I learned men with titles prefer to call their choices fate. It absolves them." The girl smiled faintly. "You speak like someone who's seen the inside of their lies." "I cleaned their floors," Margaret said. "You learn a lot down there." The girl looked at her, eyes glimmering in the light. "If you could run again, would you?" Margaret's voice caught. "Yes, but this time I'd take the child with me." A shadow moved beyond the door, light, deliberate. Margaret's hand went to the candle, snuffing it out. Both held their breath. Through the sliver of moonlight under the doorframe, a pair of boots paused, then turned away. When the echo faded, the girl whispered, "Was that him?" "No," Margaret said. "Worse. One of his men." She rose, crossed to the window slit, and looked out over the courtyard. A figure was walking toward the main gate, carrying a lantern. The serpent-headed cane glinted in the glow. "He's back," she said. "And this time, he won't leave without her." By morning, the asylum's gates bore the royal seal. A carriage stood waiting. Sister Agnes read the parchment aloud, her voice flat. "By order of the Crown's magistrate, the ward known as patient number 47 is to be transferred for further care to Ravenshade Hall under the guardianship of Lord Edmund Ravenshade." The ink was fresh, the wax still soft. Agnes lowered the document. "He has forged it." Margaret nodded. "But who will dare question a lord's seal?" The nun's hands trembled. "What will you do?" Margaret looked toward the chapel where the girl waited. "What I should have done 20 years ago." She turned to Agnes. "You'll say she died in the night." "I'll take the body to be buried." Agnes met her eyes. "And if they find you?" "Then let them dig," Margaret said. "Perhaps they'll find their conscience too." She went to the chapel, wrapped the girl in a nurse's cloak, and whispered, "We leave at dusk. Bring nothing but the blanket outside." Thunder muttered over the moors. For the first time, the girl didn't look afraid. "Where will we go?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Somewhere no one asks for names." As she said it, she didn't know that the road she chose would lead her back to the very place she once buried her guilt. and that before the week was over, Ravenshade Hall would burn. Dusk bled into the moors. The sky turned the colour of old bruises. In the small courtyard behind St. Aurelia's asylum, Margaret Elwood waited with a lantern half covered by her shawl. The rain had stopped, but the ground still steamed from it, releasing the smell of wet stone and iron. Inside her cloak, the girl trembled, not from cold, but from the kind of fear that has already burned through its own flame. "Keep your head low," Margaret whispered, "and if anyone calls, you don't turn." The asylum bell tolled vespers. The sound hid their footsteps as they slipped through the side gate and down the narrow lane that wound between the yews. Behind them, the high walls of St. Aurelia's vanished into fog. By the time they reached the edge of the moor road, night had come full and thick. The only light was from the lantern swinging in Margaret's hand and the gold thread glimmering faintly at the edge of the girl's blanket. "How far?" the girl asked. "Far enough," Margaret said. "There's a farmstead by the river. An old patient of mine keeps chickens there. He owes me kindness." They walked until the road curved toward the forest, where trees leaned together like conspirators. Every sound seemed amplified: the crack of twigs, the hiss of their breath, the far-off rumble of thunder returning for an encore. Then, from behind, came another sound, the distant roll of wheels. A carriage. Margaret's stomach turned to ice. "Off the road!" she hissed. They crouched behind a stone wall as lamps approached through the fog, two bright orbs swaying. The horses snorted, stamping mud. Through the drizzle she saw the crest painted faintly on the carriage door, a serpent wrapped around a cross. Ravenshade's men. The carriage slowed. One of the footmen dismounted, lantern in hand, sweeping it across the ditch. "Tracks," he said. "Fresh." Margaret held her breath. The girl's hand gripped hers, hard enough to hurt. "Search both sides," another voice barked. They crawled backward through the brush, every motion measured. The baby blanket snagged on a bramble. Margaret reached back to free it, the gold thread flashing once in the light. "Wait," the man shouted. "There! What was that?" "Run," Margaret whispered. They broke through the trees, branches clawing at their clothes. Behind them came the crash of pursuit, boots, dogs, shouted orders. The forest narrowed around them, thick with the smell of pine and rain. Margaret's lantern swung wildly, painting glimpses of roots and stone. Then the ground dropped away into a gully, slick with mud. She slipped, hit hard, scrambled up, dragging the girl after her. They ran until the trees thinned, and the dark outline of Ravenshade Hall appeared across the valley, its chimneys piercing the mist like blackened spires. The girl stumbled to a stop. "We're going back." "They'll search the roads," Margaret said. "They'll never think we'd go toward him." Thunder cracked overhead. "Inside that house," the girl whispered. "He murdered my mother." "Yes," Margaret said, "and it's time he answered for it." They reached the servants' entrance before midnight. The door's old hinge still creaked the way Margaret remembered. The halls beyond were silent, but not asleep. Fires smouldered, lamps burned low, and the faint echo of piano notes drifted from the drawing room. The housekeeper's bellboard still hung in the corridor, dust thick over the names. Nursery, chapel, study. Margaret's pulse quickened. "He's alone," she said. "He keeps no servants this late." They moved like ghosts through corridors that smelled of neglect. Cobwebs veiled portraits. The cradle fire in the great hearth hissed low. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar. The study. Through the crack, Margaret saw him. Lord Edmund Ravenshade sat behind the desk, a decanter at his elbow, a letter in his hand. The same serpent-headed cane leaned against the chair. He was reading by lamplight, his face hollow, drawn. When the lightning flashed, his reflection in the window looked like a different man entirely, older, afraid. Margaret motioned the girl to stay back and stepped inside. He didn't look up. "You're late," he said. Her breath caught. "You expected me?" "I've expected you for 20 years." He folded the letter. "You were always too stubborn to die quietly." She stepped closer. "You forged the magistrate's order." "I wrote what needed writing." His gaze lifted at last. "Where is she?" "Safe." "You've never been a good liar, Margaret." "Only when the truth was indecent." He rose slowly, his shadow spilling long across the rug. "Do you know what it cost me to bury that scandal? The child was a bastard of my wife's weakness. You should have drowned it when you had the chance." Her voice trembled but held. "You killed her instead." His mouth twisted. "Evelyn died of fever." "No," came another voice, soft, steady, from the doorway. The girl stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "She died because you poisoned her." For the first time in his life, Lord Ravenshade's composure faltered. His eyes widened as if he were seeing a ghost. "Who are you?" "You know?" she said. He stared. Then the truth struck, and colour drained from his face. "Impossible." "You called me impossible once before," she said, moving closer. "On the night I was born." He reached for the cane, hand shaking. "You shouldn't exist." "And yet," she said, "here I am." Margaret stepped between them. "You'll not harm her." He sneered. "What will you do? Strike me with your virtue." "No," she said, "with your own words." She reached into her cloak and drew out a folded paper, the parchment the girl had found sewn inside her blanket. He froze. "Where did you get that?" "She carried it all her life," Margaret said. "A promise written by a coward who couldn't sign his name." She held it to the lamplight and began to read. "If harm comes to my wife or her child, let this stand as my confession. What I have done cannot be undone. May God forgive what I cannot admit. E.R." He lunged forward, snatching for it. She stepped back, the candle tipping, wax spilling. The flame caught the edge of the paper. She dropped it. He tried to stamp it out, but the oil from the lamp spread fire across the rug. "Fool," he shouted, kicking at the blaze. The curtains flared. Smoke rose. Margaret grabbed the girl's hand. "Out! Now!" They ran for the door as the fire leapt to the drapes, then to the shelves. Ravenshade stumbled, coughing, his cane clattering. The room filled with light too bright for repentance. At the threshold, the girl turned. "Come with us." He looked up through the heat, eyes wild. "Leave me." There's nothing left worth saving. And for once, Margaret believed him. They fled through the servants' passage as fire raced along the beams above. The old portraits screamed silently in melting varnish. Outside, rain began again, too late for mercy. From the courtyard, they watched as flames devoured Ravenshade Hall. The roof collapsed with a sound like thunder answering thunder. The girl shivered. "He's dead." "Yes," Margaret said quietly, "but he's been dead for years." Sister Agnes arrived at dawn with Father Dunn and half the village, summoned by the smoke. When they found the two women by the yew tree, both were soaked and silent. The priest stared at the ruins, then at them. "Who's doing?" he asked. Margaret met his eyes. "God's," she said. He finally read the ledger. Dunn nodded once. "And the child?" Margaret looked at the girl, whose hair was streaked with ash and light. "Alive," she said, for the first time. By sunset, Nothing of Ravenshade remained but the chapel walls and the iron gate. The parish constable called it an accident. The papers printed it as tragedy. And in the quiet records of St. Aurelia's, the name patient number 47 was struck through with a single thin line. Margaret signed a new entry beneath it. Gabriel Ravenshade, discharged to care of guardian M. Elwood. Sister Agnes watched her write. "What will you do now?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Teach him what his parents forgot, how to tell truth from weather." Then she folded the ledger shut, placed her cross back around her neck, and whispered a final prayer for the house that had burned its own secrets clean. 20 years have a way of sanding sharp edges without erasing the grain. St. Aurelia's asylum was no longer called an asylum. The board, under new hands and new letters, had renamed it St. Aurelia's House of Rest. The walls had been lime-washed, the iron beds were fewer, the windows let in more sky than shadow. The world had changed its manners, if not always its heart. Margaret Elwood changed more slowly. Her hair went white the way paper does, suddenly when you turn the page. She walked the corridors with the same keys, the same steady step, but people stopped calling her matron with awe and began to say it with affection. Sometimes she paused under the chapel dome, where the ceiling still pretended to be sky, and counted the breaths of those she had kept alive long enough to learn their own names. On a late autumn morning, a letter arrived in a hand she knew would be tidy, even if written underwater. Morrigan and Pike. Solicitors Dunmere on Row, Madam. We require your presence in the matter of the late Sister Agnes Morley's effects, and a deed concerning property known as Ravenshade. Respectfully, H.J. Pike partner Margaret sat with it a long time before opening the envelope. Sister Agnes had died quietly in her sleep, in a chair by the chapel window, a book of psalms in her lap, and a biscuit half-eaten beside her teacup. Agnes had always believed the world would end in trumpets. Margaret had suspected it would end in yawns. Both, in a way, had been right. She made the walk to Dunmere slowly, as if distance were the right to change your mind. The solicitor's office smelled of polish and old ink. Mr. Pike was the sort of man who looked perpetually on the verge of rising from his chair but never did. He bowed, indicated a seat, and slid forward 2 items: a sealed envelope with a red wax seal, and a thin tin box familiar in shape, the kind lawyers used to keep documents that nervous people preferred never to read. "The sister entrusted these to us," he said, "for delivery upon her death to one Margaret Elwood, nurse." He pronounced nurse the way some men say, "Your Grace," which is to say with respect for work, not titles. She also left a memorandum concerning Ravenshade. Margaret's hands did not tremble, but she set them flat on the desk in case they planned to. "And what does the memorandum say?" He adjusted his spectacles. "That the estate known as Ravenshade, long in chancery since the demise of Lord Edmund, is to be released from entanglement upon satisfactory proof of heirship. A trust was established by Lady Cora Ravenshade before her death, small in coin, strong in intention." Sister Agnes believed she could supply the missing proofs. He tapped the tin. "If you will." Inside was an inventory that could have fitted into a pocket, but instead required a history, a clipping of the Dunmere Chronicle reporting the fire, a page torn from St. Aurelia's ledger with the entry patient number 47, and beneath it a later correction in Agnes's steady hand. Name, Gabriel. A notarized copy of a baptismal record with the laconic cruelty of its day. Female child, unnamed, born within wedlock to Lady Cora Ravenshade, 1895. And at the bottom, folded small enough to fit inside a thimble, a thin shaving of parchment browned at the edges. Margaret knew it before she opened it. She had seen its twin flare and curl on a study rug years ago. If harm comes to my wife or her child, let this stand as my confession. What I have done cannot be undone. May God forgive what I cannot admit. ER. Underneath, in a different hand, Agnes's, two witness statements. Hers and Father Alaric Dunn's, attesting to the confession once read aloud in Ravenshade's study, to its contents, to the flame that had eaten the first and spared only memory. Truth burns, Agnes had written, but it also leaves light. Pike cleared his throat. We shall, of course, require the heir. Margaret nodded. You shall have her. He blinked. Her? Her, Margaret repeated, and allowed herself the smallest smile. The ledger bears the clerk's error. He wrote Gabriel when he meant Gabriel. I corrected him the next hour and the next year. Names are a habit. So is erasure. Gabrielle did not live at St. Aurelia's anymore. She had left a decade earlier with a carpetbag, a reading list, and a stubbornness that made doors behave. She had worked in a library where the dust learned to fear her. She had studied bookkeeping until numbers confessed. She had sent coins when she could, and letters when she could not. I am learning to inherit, she wrote once. Not money, but responsibility. Margaret found her where she had expected, in the public room of the Queen's Ferry Inn, hunched over a ledger with a stub of pencil behind her ear, telling the innkeeper that trust was like yeast. It did not look like much until you learned what it could raise. She looked up as the bell over the door announced a customer. Her face was older in the way good faces are, more lines, more map. Grey eyes still took in a room the way a lantern does, steadily, with intent, making edges honest. The wool blanket was gone. In its place, a plain shawl. But around her wrist, tied like a superstition, a fringe of gold thread. Mother, she said, standing, and the word was without confusion or apology. Margaret set the solicitor's letter on the table. Sister Agnes sends you a last gift. And a summons. Gabriel unfolded the papers without ceremony, read quickly, then slowly, then the last line 3 times. The inn's clock ticked itself toward revelation. And if we win, she said at last, what exactly do we inherit? Stones and stories? Exactly, Margaret replied, and the right to decide what the stories are for. She expected argument. Gabriel surprised her with a nod. Then we'll tell them properly. The hearing was held in the parish hall because the courthouse leaked when it rained. 12 people attended. A clerk who had been told to bring the large stamp, a reporter from the Chronicle who wrote more adjectives than facts, 2 cousins from a northern branch of Ravenshade who looked like people born to be disappointed, Father Dunn with mud on his boots, and Mr. Pike with the posture of a man preparing to shepherd. At the long table sat the magistrate, who knew the difference between law and justice and preferred to begin at the former and end at the latter. He took the documents one by one. He asked questions as if he had all day and an opinion about eternity. He listened to Father Dunn recount the night of the fire and to Margaret tell, with an economy that came of years, how a nurse learns to weigh a secret without placing it on a scale. Finally, he asked Gabriel the question law reserves for ghosts. And who are you, in relation to this house? Gabriel did not look at Margaret for permission. I am the daughter of Lady Cora Ravenshade and the ward of Margaret Elwood. I was hidden to save a name and kept to save a life. I have lived within the walls of silence and outside them. If the house is mine, it will be made useful, or I do not want it. The magistrate's mouth twitched into something that might one day grow into a smile. He stamped where stamps go. The cousins sighed into the available air like punctured bellows. In the matter of Ravenshade, he said, This court recognizes Gabriel Ravenshade as heir to the property and effects thereof, such as they are, and commends the stewardship to which she has been informally subject. He glanced toward Margaret, which, if the world were better written, we would call motherhood. Pike coughed for form and extended a small iron key, blackened with age. It looked indecently small for so much history. Gabrielle took it and did something no one expected. She placed it in Margaret's palm. "Open it," she said. Margaret stared. "It is not mine." "It was," Gabrielle said gently. "You closed it once for my sake. Open it now for yours." The remains of Ravenshade Hall were a lesson in words we pretend are permanent: grandeur, lineage, authority, and how quickly they consent to ash. The chapel stood mostly whole, like a memory that refused to participate in forgetfulness. The rest was low walls, startled chimneys, a gate that knew too much. Yew trees wore the years like shawls. They made no speeches. They walked. They measured what could be salvaged. Father Dunn found a fragment of stained glass and held it to the light until it made the air behave. Mr. Pike took notes about boundaries. The cousins took their leave without asking for sandwiches. The Chronicle man wrote the word poignant and misspelled it. Margaret and Gabriel stood before the chapel door. The iron key turned with a reluctance that felt like dignity. Inside, the air smelled of stone remembering water. Dust drifted through shafts of light the way snow does when it has forgotten how to fall. On the altar lay a parcel, wrapped in oilcloth, unimaginative as hope. Father Dunn blinked. "I swear I did not place that there." Margaret lifted it. The string had been tied by someone who feared both hands and consequences. Inside were papers, accounts in an unfamiliar fine hand, letters signed Cora in ink that had not learned to fade, and at the bottom, a little silk purse. In it, a charm, a silver cross, very small, nicked at the edge where a child's teeth had once tested the world. Margaret had not known she could make the sound she made. It was not a sob. It was the noise a bell makes when rung by memory. Gabrielle took the cross, turned it in her hand, and then, with deliberation worthy of any sacrament, slipped its chain over Margaret's head. "You dropped this," she said softly, "in a century that kept the floor untidy." Margaret laughed through the trouble in her throat. "I pawned it for coal." "Then it has already warmed a house once," Gabrielle said. "We'll let it do so again." They set up a trestle table in the chapel and spread the papers. Numbers lined up, names volunteered, intentions confessed. Cora's letters were as clear as old water. "If anything happens to me, see that the income from the lower farms is kept for our people. Nurses, laundresses, the women who kept this place alive when it wished them dead. Call it charity if you must. I call it debt." By winter, under Pike's patient arithmetic and Dunn's impatient sermons, Ravenshade House of Recovery took its first patients. Mill girls with lungs that rattled, boys with hands too old for their age, widows whose grief had metastasized into silence. The chapel became a ward for convalescents who liked their saints on the ceiling and their nurses on the ground. The yew trees were left standing, witnesses promoted to staff. Some nights, when the lamps were being turned down and the corridors remembered to be quiet, Gabrielle walked the perimeter with the brisk tread of a woman making friends with land rather than owning it. She counted the windows lighted and named them promises. She learned which floorboards complained and which walls forgave drafts. She discovered the exact place in the garden where, if you stood at dusk, the bell sounded like a heartbeat. On such a night, she found Margaret by the chapel steps, looking at the sky as if reading an old letter by new light. "I'm thinking of Agnes," Margaret said, without turning. She wrote that truth would spring out of the earth and righteousness look down from heaven. I used to think that was optimism. Perhaps it was merely gardening. Gabriel smiled. We are good at digging. We had practice, Margaret said. The bell rang for evening. Patients shuffled towards soup with the serious faces of the famished. Father Dunn tripped on the step and made a joke of it before anyone else could. Mr. Pike arrived with a crate of blankets and an apology for their colour. A child, no one could say whose, ran the length of the hall with a whistle made of yew. Margaret slipped her arm through Gabriel's. The silver cross, warm from her skin, tapped lightly against bone. Do you think, Gabriel asked, that houses can learn? Yes, Margaret said, when those who live in them do. They stood a moment longer, not in mourning but in inventory, of breath, of light, of lives that had found a better ledger. And when at last they turned inside, the chapel lamps brightened one by one, a patient echo of a promise kept. The night settled around Ravenshade without weight, like a blanket that, after years of gold-threaded pretense, had remembered what it was for. In the quiet that followed, with doors watched and windows open, the story ended where the best ones do, not with triumph shouted, but with mercy practiced. For there are children hidden to be forgotten, and children hidden to be remembered, and some houses, if given time, will learn the difference. Justice does not always arrive early, Margaret said later, as if to herself, but it never forgets the address.